press record on the first panel. And we have this panel that we will have recorded. And so we're back. Thanks, everybody. We have a great panel coming up, and Ken is going to lead us in that panel. You will notice, if you're online, that the video feed from the room here is about 5 seconds delayed because I'm on a hotspot on my computer, and so it's just terrible. So apologies to people online. You'll have a kind of choppy, delayed video. Ken, I'm turning it over to you to introduce your panel and to kick us off. This is about the future, and I'll put my little plug in, which is panelists and everyone. This is an opportunity to help Maine and its Climate Council and the working groups think through policy options for an updated climate action plan. So as you're thinking about your answers and Ken's questions, think about how people in Maine might be able to take this and translate it into policy recommendations for the state going forward. Okay, Ken, over to you.
Thanks very much, David. And I'm just so thrilled with that first panel. These two panels, Ian and I both shot to get the A team. And since we have pretty good Rolodexes, we were thinking the A team of the country. And I solicited, and Ian did, 3 or 4 people, and only one had a conflict. So this is we are hearing from the best people in the country and arguably the world on some of these issues. Jim Lazar I've asked each of my panelists to make an opening statement, provide some initial thoughts. Jim Lazar will start that off. Jim and I worked together at the Regulatory Assistance Project for a decade. And Jim's been operating as an economist and rate design expert for far longer than that, and has written more guidebooks and manuals than I have fingers to count them with. So it's doubly a treat for me to have Jim join us. Then Lorenzo Christoph. Lorenzo spent the bulk of the last 25 years working on market design and system planning for the California ISO. One of the duck chart that I showed you this morning was originated from that organization. And Lorenzo was trying to ensure that it all worked effectively. But for the last 5 years, he's really started trying to figure out for us all DER, distributed energy resources, market participation, how to have them, those resources get animated in markets. That subject came up this morning with Chris and Jeff. Working on distribution system operators ideas. We have transmission operators. Why not have distribution operators? And not surprisingly then distribution level markets. And Lorenzo's also been really active on the community side, which is of interest for us here in Maine. What about local energy resilience and microgrids and so forth? So it's an equal treat to have Lorenzo Christoph with us as well. Doug Hurley was on the same path, working for 18 years at Synapse, one of the nation's best consulting firms for the kinds of things we're talking about, and then decided that he might want to actually do some of this stuff instead of just advise on it. So Doug is with an aggregator and similar to the gentleman this morning, other than Ahmed, called Ice Tech. And so Doug could tell us more about that, but also more importantly, what it means for Maine and what directions we should head. As the title suggests, we're looking for what can Maine do, what are best practices out there, what are opportunities we should focus on, and what obstacles should we anticipate. But most importantly, given the context of the Maine Climate Council, what should we actually do? What should we actually recommend and get going on here in Maine in order to be leaders on load flexibility and managing our demand? Like Ian did, I'll ask have some few questions afterwards, and then hopefully we'll also have some time for others in the room to ask questions that occur to them. So with that, let me turn it over to Jim.
All right. Well, thanks, Ken. Let me make sure I'm being heard and my slides are up. We're good?
You
Yep,
are
we've
muted.
got you.
Great. All right. So load flexibility is really essential for a reliable power system today. In 1980, we used to forecast demand and schedule generation from power plants that looked like this. And today in 2024, we're now forecasting generation from power plants that look like these, and we need to therefore be able to schedule demand. It's a big change. Flexibility helps all parts of the system. And in an ISO area, without a single utility in control of both generation and delivery, this is important. Load flexibility can help us snip some peaks. These are price spikes that occurred in ISO New England yesterday and the day before. But it also can help us with, this is a transformer heat map for one distribution transformer showing how the transformer heats up in the summer months. And that could cause both aging and failure of the transformers, but also the line losses are much higher when the transformer is hot. And both of these values are important to reliability, and they're also value to keep customer bills under control. So I wrote a little paper a decade ago this month, teaching the duck to fly, that started with Lorenzo's duck curve and then applied 10 strategies to it of controlling loads and acquiring specific resources. If you haven't read Teaching the Duck to Fly, it's on the RAP website, and I think it's still an excellent read. We did do a second edition in 2016 with some better examples. I want to turn for just a moment to Seattle City Light's electrification study. This is one of the best pieces of analysis of a power system I've seen in my 40-plus year career. Seattle City Light is a municipal utility. It serves the city of Seattle and some of the suburbs. It's about a 2,000 megawatt utility, so same order of magnitude as the state of Maine. Seattle examined every single distribution circuit on their system. Most of them could not handle peak load under electrification circumstances. So they assumed electrification of all space heat, all water heat, and all personal transportation. And the dark areas on this map were the circuits that had zero or negative capacity remaining. But they did something I've never seen in a distribution study. They then examined on a peak day, more than half of the circuits could handle the daily energy load across the day if it was spread out, but not the maximum hourly load. On those circuits, they had a choice of either increasing the size, the capacity of the distribution circuit to manage electrification, or using demand management and local storage to avoid expensive distribution capacity upgrades. And that's where I've never seen a distribution study look at the energy carrying capability of a system and look at storage and load management as alternatives. So that load management is really going to come in several forms. Water heaters are a huge one, and electric vehicles are an increasingly large one. Both have large storage capacity, meaning that we can charge them when the power is cheap, and then use them when we want to take a shower or drive to work. Water heaters and AVs are a lot alike. They're about the same demand when they're charging. They're about the same annual energy use. And somehow the power grid is adapted across the US to serving 65 million electric water heaters, and people are worried that we won't be able to handle 65 million EVs. I don't share that fear. We've got some work to do, but we know how to do it. So those are some of the load management tools, but Seattle is also looking local storage. Local storage can handle most of the rest of the flexibility that's needed. Now, that local storage might be battery banks at substations, where the problem is at the subtransmission level or the transmission level. It may be residential batteries, and we've just heard the previous panel talking about the role of residential batteries. But I think the vast majority of it is going to be in the cars that we have in our garage. My friend Gene has 150 kilowatt hours parked in his garage. And he's looking forward to the day when that can be dispatched to back up his house for providing essential services for a week during a major ice storm, or also provide services back to the grid and reduce his cost of ownership. I do need to touch on rate design. Ahmed talked about this. Ahmed and I were sort of arch nemesis in our professional career. He was working for the utilities. I was working for consumer and environmental interests. After we retired and shed our client bias, we discovered we were standing in almost exactly the same place, shouting in opposite directions. We deal with rate design every day of our lives. And this rate design is easy to understand. It says a third scoop's only another 50 cents. And well, so why not? And as a result, I don't know, 70% of Americans are overweight. That's a rate design impact. Rate design should make the choices that the customer makes to minimize their own bill consistent with the choices they would make to minimize system costs. Rates in Maine do not do that. Rates in California do not do that. And rates in between, with very few exceptions, and I would say Oklahoma Gas and Electric and Fort Collins, Colorado are the most notable exceptions. But rates in between California and Maine do not do that. We've got hundreds of pilot studies that have been done on different kinds of rate design. Simple TOU rate, shown in blue, can produce about a 10% reduction in peak demand. If you add technology like smart thermostats and smart water heaters, you can get that up to 20%. Peak time rebates and critical peak pricing, basically the same thing, looked at from two different sides of the issue, can produce 20% reductions in peak demand, and with technology assistance, up to 40 and 50% reductions in peak demand. We know this stuff works. I guess I'm going to, place that I would disagree with Ahmed is I'm in favor of the Fort Collins approach of mandatory smart pricing, but coupled with that, providing customers with the technology to respond. I don't see the point in concealing the cost associated with service at high cost hours when either the grid is under stress or the bulk power system's under stress. Rate design is a key element to facilitating flexible loads. It's really pretty simple. Power should be cheap. When power is cheap, prices should be low. When power is expensive or the grid is congested, prices should be high. Demand charges are an archaic rate form that largely needs to be confined to the site-specific capacity investments. And this is where, in the commercial sector, Maine has, in my opinion, gone very, very wrong. Critical peak pricing with really sharply higher rates during the time of great system stress, or peak time rebates where customers get rewards for curtailing below their normal usage levels during extreme peaks, are also work very well. I've got some examples of those that we may get into, but I'm going to quiet down for a while and look forward to hearing from my fellow panelists.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Jim. That was a great introduction for us. Lorenzo.
Okay, thank you. Thanks very much for the invitation to participate in this workshop today and for the introduction. Just fill in a little bit more background because I have been involved in electricity policy for 30 years, not just in California, but on some national efforts and other places. I tend to think in terms of the whole system. And so as I started thinking about distributed resources 10 years ago when I worked at California ISO, we saw these front-of-the-meter resources that were being procured by the utilities under a feed-in tariff kind of program that the CPUC implemented, 2, 3, 4, 5 megawatt size facilities that the utilities procured and that then wanted to participate in the ISO market. And the question that started to come to mind for me is, the ISO runs a market optimization that has 450 some resources in it, from very big things like nuclear power plant and smaller things like gas turbines. But what would it be like if we had 30,000 generators that were producing power around the state? How would we think differently about how the system functions as a whole system? So what I want to do today in a few minutes remarks is expand the frame of what we're talking about. I realize your focus is demand management. I want to step a little bit outside that and think about a bigger picture of where DERs can take us and the possibilities, especially the possibilities when it comes to the big picture policy goals that most states are trying to achieve, having to do with decarbonization, as well as more near-term kinds of concerns like resilience, being able to have power supply running when there are grid outages due to extreme climate events, and then also some of the aspects of energy justice or equity, which have become quite prominent in policy discussions at federal levels and state levels. But I don't think we've got sufficient ideas of what it actually means and how we can bring the benefits of the clean energy transition to more customers. So I want to expand the frame a little bit from thinking about distributed resources as being behind the meter on customer premises and providing demand management, to thinking about distributed resources as supply resources, supply of renewable energy. How can they contribute to the total energy we need? And I noticed that someone earlier put a comment to this effect in the chat. I think it was Thomas Welch. He asked about this distinction between resources that may move power around or manage load versus ones that actually supply energy. The 20th century concept of electric power system had a bifurcation between the supply side, which is largely the bulk power system, big utility scale resources, high voltage transmission. All the power was generated there. Then down at the other end with one-way distribution wires, we had customers that are turning things on and off and consuming energy, and they're consumers, and you had this nice bifurcation. The thing that happens with distributed resources and distributed resource technologies is that now supply can be anywhere. It's not just on one side, traveling one way over wires. And anywhere is not just behind the meter, but also local, at community levels, at neighborhood levels, et cetera. So I want to expand the definition of distributed resources to include supply resources or supply plus storage hybrid resources that can be in front of the meter, connected directly to the distribution system. But the word distributed in DERs simply means that it's connected somewhere at distribution level rather than being part of directly connected to the bulk power system and the wholesale market operator like the ISO. So what this leads then is to a different way of thinking, also going back to the 20th century mindset, which is still very prevalent in the industry today. That is, we measure demand and we forecast it out over a time horizon, 10, 15, 20, maybe 30 years. And then we start planning capacity largely on the bulk system in order to increase the ability to supply more energy. And then we think about demand management on the demand side in order to manage that side of it. Again, that bifurcation. But suppose we were to flip the planning paradigm on its head, because with the technologies that we have available today, essentially every neighborhood could have an electric power system. And when I think about planning for energy, you know, one of the things that has bugged me for a long time is this notion that if you want to put rooftop solar on your house, you should plan your solar installation to meet the needs of your house. Well, what if you have a shady roof? If you do, then you can't put solar panels on because it doesn't pay off. So why does it make sense for me to limit the size of the solar installation on my roof when I could produce twice as much power if I have a sunny roof and supply one of my neighbors or more of my neighbors? So I want to think about energy planning at a community level or at a neighborhood level so that we could do things like, say, co-optimize solar installations with tree canopy. As we move into a hotter climate future, we want trees, but there's this competition. So let's think differently. And with distributed resources and the potential to scale to almost infinitely to any size or any need or any kind of customized uses, think about planning as, well, how much of my need can I meet from on-site assets? How much of my need could we meet locally? And this gets into city planning, urban planning, or county planning. How do we use local opportunities to produce energy and use them to produce local energy? So it's a bottom-up planning framework. And this came to mind especially last year when I attended at the California Energy Commission. They were holding workshops about Senate Bill 100. It was a bill passed in 2018, which says that California has to meet 100% of its electricity consumption from carbon-free energy resources by the year 2045. And the legislation tasked the agencies with coming up with different pathways to get to the 2045 target and then evaluate those pathways and so on. As I looked at their analytical framework that they were presenting, it was back in this 20th century bifurcation. In other words, building out assets on the bulk power system, utility scale generation, high voltage transmission, et cetera, all the while noting that there were huge challenges to that in the form of being able to plan long distance transmission and implement it, as well as land use concerns, using farmland, using habitat, and so on. And so there's opposition that gets in the way of those kinds of things. And then at the other end, demand management, demand response of various flavors, flexibility, and so on. What was completely missing was the potential to build out, maximize distributed solar plus storage, through installing generation capacity on the built environment. That is, building solar production facilities on the roofs of warehouses, shopping malls, schools, parking garages, irrigation canals, and so on. That gets left out of the model when we're thinking purely about bulk system versus demand management. So again, there's a kind of bottom-up planning. We could, and I've got a group working on some estimates of what this potential capacity is, and a massive amount of the future demand for renewable energy could be met through building on the built environment. So then another way of expanding the frame is to go from individual consumers then, or individual customers and what they might install, to thinking about community level and the potential to do to meet demand needs from local supply that could be locally owned. For example, a town has a fleet of buses that it wants to electrify. Most planning studies will say, well, all this new electrification demand is going to go to the grid, so we have to build bulk system assets in order to meet it. Well, what if a city or a local customer-owned co-op or a tribal authority wants to build a vehicle charging facility with solar and perhaps wind, stationary battery storage, charge buses, and offer a vehicle charging service which is self-supplied for energy, doesn't add demand to the grid, can be a locally owned enterprise, and then as a locally owned business, be generating wealth and income that stays in the community. So there are possibilities then with these local resources that I see as really the expansion of distributed resources, both necessary for the goals that we want to accomplish, that is decarbonization, local resilience when there are disruptions, when the grid goes down, all of the reinforcement of grid assets doesn't help when there's a grid outage. We still need ways to provide power locally, at least for essential services during grid outages. And then necessary also for equity or social justice reasons where we can turn electricity supply into more of a local business owned by co-ops or by local government agencies, et cetera. Added to this, I would just mention one other thing, is that the cost and performance trends of distributed resources of all kinds, rapidly improving in performance, declining in cost, being very flexible and scalable to different applications and so on, while in many places grid costs are going up. So this trend, these intersecting trends are going to create very strong incentives for customers like businesses and affluent residential customers who have the money to invest as they see their grid costs getting more expensive, as Ahmed eloquently talked about this morning in California. The temptation to provide for their own needs and defect from the grid simply because it's not offering the value that we can get by installing on-site and local resources. So what I've been thinking for a while then, is that our policy framework, by bifurcating into this bulk system resource development versus just demand management, and leaving out the potential of local supply resources and the benefits they can bring through being located locally, providing jobs as well as local income, assets, et cetera. That's really a missing piece that we need to develop. So finally, then the questions I get to are what kinds of policies and regulatory structures can release the greatest value from distributed resources? And in my thinking, that all comes down to the distribution network. The 20th century paradigm forever has viewed the distribution network really as one-way power flow. Get power from the bulk power system, take it to customers at the other end. And what I think is the necessary evolution is to redefine electric distribution service as operating a transactional network where the owners of DERs can actually participate in a local market. They can sell energy locally that flows to serve local loads and local customers. And essentially undo, there's a bias in the way we've constructed the market and policy frameworks that makes local resources more expensive than they need to be. Essentially, if we have, say, a local 3, 4, 5 megawatt solar plus storage facility and it's injecting power into the distribution network, that power flows by the laws of physics to serve nearby load. It'll follow the path of least resistance and get totally absorbed by nearby loads. But the regulatory and market fiction says that injected energy flows up to the bulk power system, to the ISO, and then the ISO sends power back down to serve the load. And so what that means is then there are costs that these distributed energy transactions have to pay that don't reflect their actual usage of the system. In other words, that power is entirely within the distribution circuits, but it's paying, the resource is paying ISO participation charges, it's building ISO telemetry and communications, and the customers are paying transmission charges on top of their bills in order to get power that's coming from a local resource. So I'll quit here now and basically just say, look, we want to think about then policy and regulatory frameworks that are going to release the value of local resources by creating a participatory network where every DER owner can be now a participant in economic transactions using that network. So I'll stop and take a breath, and thank you very much for listening.
Lorenzo, thanks so much. It'll come as no surprise that the Maine Climate Council is interested equally in many of the issues you raised, certainly resilience, certainly equity. So it's almost as though you've been reading my questions. So we'll revisit those. But before we do, Doug, let's hear from you first.
Great, thanks, Ken. And hello, everyone. You can hear me okay? Thumbs up from someone?
Yes.
Great, thank you, Michael, Jim, and others. Good morning. No, just, good morning still, just by a few minutes to everyone. As Ken mentioned, I'm Doug Hurley, Vice President of Policy with Ice Tech Energy Services. And I hope that you all are as energized by what we've heard so far as I am this morning. This is, I really want to thank you for inviting me and thank you all for being here. It's such an incredibly important problem. I changed careers 20 years ago specifically to address this problem. And I really want to thank you all for having me here. And I personally am really energized by the reminder of just how many people are working to make good things happen in various ways. So I hope you get some of that too. And I'm going to try to provide more of that. I don't have any slides, but I do have a couple of screens I'm going to show you in a minute or two that I hope provide you with more comfort that this is all possible and we can do this. Ice Tech is doing it right now. The quick history that I have, I think, will help lead into what we want to talk about here. So 20 years ago, I had a career in technology in Silicon Valley during the whole tech boom thing. And I needed to change careers to essentially affect this problem. Climate change, I knew even at that time was such a huge problem. We're already 40 years too late in addressing it. How could I help? And that's when I found Synapse, and I did a lot of the studies and rate design kind of work, not nearly as much as Jim and Lorenzo and some others have done, but I did a bunch of that work. Most of my work was interacting with ISO New England and other similar organizations in other parts of the country and up in Canada as well, on behalf of consumer advocates like your Maine public advocate and the other New England states and Mid-Atlantic and elsewhere. But also clean energy providers. And full disclosure, on behalf of Efficiency Maine, I interact with ISO New England for their programs. And so I want you to think, when you hear the word markets and what about the markets, I want you to think of it, if you could, in at least 3 different segments. One is interconnection. How do new resources get interconnected to the system, which has its own problems currently? The other is the wholesale markets themselves, which is how much revenue can you earn and how do you react to grid signals when you're actually operating. And then the other one that I think is critically important is planning. If you have these resources available, what do the state utilities and the ISO New England do with their planning to actually incorporate that? Because we have seen numerous examples where we are bringing solar onto the system, we are bringing DERs onto the system, we are bringing efficiency onto the system, and that gets ignored because the folks who run the system aren't so comfortable with these newfangled things yet. And so they make investments that we pay for that then ultimately were not needed. They won't need it. And we're trying to make sure that we don't repeat those mistakes. So after doing that for, as Ken said, 18 years at Synapse, doing that kind of work, I switched over to Ice Tech. And the reason I switched over to Ice Tech specifically, I think is important here. Ice Tech is a small company that I had done some work with, who had for 20 years been helping large customers, hospitals, universities, manufacturers, et cetera, of different kinds, who have their own on-site power plant, typically called combined heat and power. And they typically have a team of people whose job it is to operate that plant. And they still, even with a team of people, they still need to hire someone, in our case, Ice Tech, to help them manage that and run it to optimize lots of different things. Costs on their end, market revenues, increasingly avoided CO2 emissions. We have several customers and we've developed a tool that will help them monitor their carbon emissions in real time. So how much power are they consuming from the grid and what is the current CO2 rate on the grid, and help them track and report to their management or whomever the amount of CO2 emissions that they can attribute to themselves and try and manage that, obviously. So they had done this work for 20 years, and I saw the complexity of the solution that my now colleagues at Ice Tech were addressing between meeting electrical needs on the campus, meeting steam needs on the campus, running the power plant, when to import power, when to not import power, what do you do during maintenance outages, all of those problems and the complexity of that. And I said, this is a group of people who can help us figure out how to manage some necessary things on the grid like storage. I'm primarily focused on battery storage, which is one kind of demand flexibility. There are lots of different kinds and we need all of them. Battery storage is a big piece of that, and that's what I'm dedicated to at the moment. So that's the reason I went to Ice Tech, and we are currently doing that. And I'm going to share my screen real quick just to share with you what that means. Can I get a thumbs up from maybe Jim or Lorenzo that says you can see? Okay. So this is an active battery in Massachusetts right now. And what you're seeing on the screen is how much power they're consuming at their factory, what the battery is doing, what their on-site combined heat and power plant is doing, how much they're pulling in from the grid. And you can see over time where, if we go here, I think it is, you can see that yesterday, the ISO New England asked us to discharge our battery. And then for 2 hours roughly, 2 hours yesterday afternoon, during that evening ramp to some of the slides earlier when, I think it was Ken, when you were talking about the duck curve, that steep evening ramp is typically when we get dispatched, not in the middle of the day. It's usually in the morning, and in the evening is when we get called upon by the grid operator to manage, to dispatch. And just to address something that came up earlier, we can do this not just on an hourly basis, but this is a couple of sites in New England that are operating two different 5 megawatt batteries on a 4-second basis. So we are literally managing a signal from the ISO every 4 seconds. And you can see it here over the last several days, up and down and up and down and up and down, based on a signal. This is called the frequency regulation market in New England. And we are participating in this market and getting paid for it. And you can see at the moment, the status of this is not in regulation. It's called utility peak prep. And that's because the utility in this case that we're working with has contracted us to say, okay, we need you during certain hours of every month that are directly tied to transmission costs. I'll get to that in a second. But that only happens a few times a year. I think if I read correctly in some of the efficiency Maine documentation, it's up to 15 hours a year or 15 events a year, I forget exactly. Outside of that, we participate in the regulation market. But then when they call us and tell us, hey, we think that we're going to have a peak event later today, boom, we charge up the battery, and it's sitting right now waiting for them to alert us with an automatic signal that says, okay, now we need you to discharge the battery in order to pull down the load that we would otherwise be pulling from the grid to avoid those costs. And at the moment, those costs are often in correlation with CO2 emissions, because it's more likely higher costs right now are going to mean we're running, say, an oil plant instead of a natural gas plant. So this is entirely possible, and we are doing it today. We are doing it on a smaller scale at larger customers than what you heard from some of the folks earlier today. They're doing smaller amounts at lots and lots of customers. We are focused on a smaller number of customers, but larger customers, and trying to have that same impact. Personally, I find it really interesting and incredibly important to try and manage these different pieces. And I think we can do it. We are doing it already. We just have to do a lot more of it. This panel is supposed to talk about the future, so I want to spend a minute or two talking about, what I just showed you is what's happening today. But as we go out into the future, there's going to be a bunch of other things that we're going to have to change. There's been a lot of talk about time of use rates. You heard that early this morning and just earlier on this panel. I'm entirely a fan of voluntary time of use rates. Voluntary could be either opt-in or opt-out. There's reasons on both sides of that. But it has to be voluntary, in my opinion, because lots and lots of customers don't have any ability to respond to it. And as I mentioned earlier, we work with customers who have a team of people who operate these plants, and still they find the need to hire someone outside of their organization who have the expertise that I have about what ISO New England is doing. And things like time of use rates, I think, can have a good effect. But as someone mentioned earlier, to tell customers your rate is lower at night and higher during the day. Oh, but then change that next summer, and then change that next summer again, and then next summer you change. Customers widespread are just not going to want to manage that. Furthermore, if you looked at that duck curve on the system, rates probably shouldn't be higher in the middle of the day because we have enough solar on the system that on any bright sunny day, the middle of the day is a great time for my batteries, especially if we start to add as much wind as is in the interconnection queue. I'm going to have negative prices during the middle of the day. I'm going to want to charge my battery then, but those morning and evening ramp times are the ones that we're going to have to be ready to discharge. So the needs of the system, I think, are changing rapidly enough for very good reasons that you're going to need to have a whole suite of people out there doing what we're doing to help customers who obviously get to make all of their own decisions. But they need someone to come in and give the expertise that we're going to have as this grid changes in order to achieve what needs to happen in a way that keeps costs as low as possible. And still maintains the reliability that people are accustomed to. So I'll stop there because I'm much more interested in getting to the questions. And I hope that's helpful. Thank you again.
Very helpful, Doug. One thing that's come through clearly is, as was mentioned in the first panel, there aren't technical and software obstacles. There are policy and financial and other obstacles, but you're showing that it's being done now illustrates that quite clearly. And I'm also pleased that you mentioned frequency regulation. We have sort of purposely set this up with the idea that we're talking about demand for kilowatt hours and how that happens and when. But there is a whole nother set that those kilowatt hours need to maintain specifications that don't kill your equipment. And there's a whole market for those what are called ancillary services as well. And the good news is the load flexibility we're talking about helps meet those as well. And that's what Doug was proving in that chart that he showed with all of the ups and downs. So there is another market. It's a little bit in the weeds for what we wanted to do, but it does exist and it is addressed by the same results. Jim has his hand up, so I'll go next to you, Jim, and then pose a question to the panel.
Jim, you're muted.
I was just thrilled with Doug's presentation. It was just outstanding to show an actual facility operating in real time. My guess is that the battery bank at that factory was installed primarily for local resilience purposes and to manage that site's own demand charges. And playing, I'll call it playing in the ancillary services market, is a third job for those batteries. And the point that Doug made, I think that's really critical, is a lot of distributed energy resources can handle more than one job, and we need to examine them based on all of the values that they bring. I've seen study after study that said, well, controlled water heaters are not a really good investment because the capacity value they bring isn't very high. But if you add in all of the values that they bring in the ancillary services market, in load shifting, in load shedding, and load building, you get a different answer. Am I correct, Doug, that battery bank may have picked up a third job that it didn't know it was applying for?
You asked a really good question, and one part of my answer is all of these batteries are going to pick up jobs they didn't sign up for originally over the next couple of years, because what they thought was going to be most important is not going to be most important. Here's what drove those two different battery installations that I was showing. The one was primarily driven, I'm going to say, having run through the numbers with them, by a state program in Massachusetts that pays them to reduce load during peak hours. You heard Chris Rauscher talk about it earlier, called Connected Solutions. Connected Solutions, in my mind, is driven at those peak costs that I forget now who it was, showed that Massachusetts was, a very small percentage of the load drives a big chunk of their cost. And so that's a big revenue source for them. Second one from them really is transmission costs. Those in the weeds know that I'm going to throw out some numbers, but I promise I'll make them relative. Right now, the highest amount of power you consume in a year, called your annual peak, costs about $2 a kilowatt month. But the amount that we're paying for transmission costs right now is $10 a kilowatt month. And the $2 number over the next couple of years, we already know these values, is going to go to about $2.50 and then $3. That transmission cost is going to go from 10 to 11 to 12 to $15. So they're signing up for, I'll tell you what, I can save that much money by reducing costs, a couple times a month. In order to pick the right one every month, you got to pick a couple of them just to make sure you catch it. So that's that's probably the next biggest driver. And then you get into other drivers as well, like the energy market. I would love to do more energy market arbitrage, which for now is still lining up with CO2. Lower costs are more aligned with cleaner hours, and higher costs are more aligned with dirtier hours. And I would love to be able to pull more clean energy and then discharge to avoid as much dirty energy as I possibly can. We're doing some of that now, not as much as I would like to do.
Thanks so much, Jim, for the question, and Doug for the answer. I should have pointed out in Doug's chart, for those of you who might not find it as easy to read, that factory that he mentioned was drawing on the order of 2.6, 2.7 megawatts. And the amount the factory was pulling from the grid was 0 or 0.1, 0.2. So essentially a standalone distributed energy resource supplying that factory. So, and thanks for mentioning the transmission point as well. That goes directly to Lorenzo's point about if we can keep it local, we can save some money here.
Let me add one
gentlemen,
more comment to that, if I may, Ken, just to, as
please.
Jim brought up the notion of stacking services. Another service that same battery can provide is, if you think sort of upstream on the distribution circuit to some point where you could disconnect from the grid, that battery could be a grid forming resource to operate a microgrid when there's an outage on the system upstream. It could isolate the circuit and actually maintain frequency and serve all the customers on that circuit.
Amen. Amen. Well, this has been so good that my 5 questions are going to have to get shrunk pretty materially. But one that I think is important, particularly for the council to consider in its next recommendations to the state, is how we get to this point. I mean, when I opened this morning, I talked about the system needs to be balanced. And that's pretty much the case, whether it's a big grid, or a multi-state grid, or whether it's a local microgrid. The question in transitioning either to the level that Lorenzo was describing, or even anywhere more distributed than what we have now, raises the questions of how we get there. What's that transition look like? Who's responsible for balancing, and how's it conducted? Do you have any thoughts for us in terms of guidance for how Maine can be most effective in approaching that issue? Recognizing, of course, that we are part of ISO New England, but there's a lot of communities in Maine that are thinking the way Lorenzo's thinking. So how do we deal with the balance issue while we're transitioning to something that's perhaps more distributed? Go ahead, Doug.
So I'll offer one thought anyway, which is we have several different cost drivers that we're trying to reduce for any customer, as well as potential revenue sources. And one of the struggles that we have is when those things clash with each other. And I'll give you an example from Massachusetts. One part of Connected Solutions says, we want you to dispatch every single day from this hour to this hour, and that's how you're going to get paid. Those are typically hotter days with higher costs and a higher draw on the transmission system. So that is a good thing. However, as you noted earlier on the screens that I showed, We got dispatched from 7 to 9 p.m. yesterday because that's the evening peak. And, or yeah, 5 to 7, 1700 to 1900. And we get dispatched in the morning peak. So we have two different revenue sources that are telling us two different things. One says, I want you to dispatch in the morning and in the evening. And the other one says, I want you to dispatch in the middle of the day. So I would just ask, I mean, there are very good reasons for why Massachusetts chose those hours when they made that decision. But I would ask that as you think through these policies, do whatever you can to try and make these different possible sources integrate with each other, because it's going to make it a lot easier for us to respond when and where you want all of this flexible demand to respond.
Nice. Thanks. Lorenzo.
I would add, I think a pivotal policy change that could really change the economics for local resources is to allow energy transactions that are entirely within the distribution system and don't go through the wholesale market and the ISO market system. From the ISO's perspective, when you generate electricity locally and it's offset by local loads physically, the way power flows, all the ISO sees is a reduction in net demand at the TD interface, transmission distribution interfaces. But right now, the construct adds all of the wholesale market and transmission charges onto those local transactions. So I think one thing that policy could do at a state level is create a framework for local transactions, generation produced locally, serving local load without going through the wholesale market. And then thinking about planning, this was mentioned earlier as well, we don't have good planning methods to look at high DER growth scenarios and take them into account. As a result, when transmission planners think about what the system needs are, they're planning too much transmission because we've not adequately reflected the potential to build out local resources. And that's an area also where work is happening now. Let's develop the methodologies for developing high DER growth scenarios to employ in system planning exercises.
Wonderful, wonderful.
I couldn't agree with, you saw me give my 2 thumbs up. I couldn't agree with Lorenzo more. I couldn't agree with him more on that one. It's been such a frustration for me for so many years. And it's just, I mean, several months ago, I drove up to Portland for a meeting with the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and a bunch of people from New England, where we heard the CEO of ISO New England and the COO of ISO New England repeat several times over and over again, no, we as an electric grid don't need to pay, and then when I say the ISO pays, all customers eventually pay for that, for a natural gas terminal. And the reason we don't need to pay for that, and we thought before that we did, is because we've done enough energy efficiency and solar and other distributed resources that it turns out we don't need that anymore. And you can go watch the video from that FERC technical conference in Portland if you want, from this past summer. It was fantastic. It was absolutely fantastic news. It felt like finally we got through to them that if you recognize the amount of energy efficiency done, the amount of solar we've done, and the other resources, you can say, you know what? Actually, we don't need to invest in that anymore. We may still invest in it for other reasons, and other people may pay for it, and maybe that's okay. But they're starting to recognize that, and it can make such a huge difference.
And the important thing here is that there were thousands or tens of thousands of decisions by individual customers and aggregators and businesses that together made it possible to avoid the investment in a natural gas receiving terminal. And recognizing the value of each of those tens of thousands of decisions and transactions is extremely challenging.
Excellent, excellent, thanks. Well, let me then pick up on my second question and try to get a few from the audience as well. And the second one relates to the issue, Lorenzo, you brought up about equity. The Maine Climate Council is endeavoring to do everything it does with an equity lens as well. Maine, as you know, is not only one of the most rural states, it's also one of the most aged states. It's not one of the most affluent states, especially outside of its southernmost tier. So how can we best move in this transition in a way that enhances equity, that meets the needs of disadvantaged populations? There was a reference to this in the morning panel as well, but particularly coupling it with the transition. I'd be interested in any thoughts that would help the energy, transportation, and buildings working groups move in their recommendations to the council, and the council eventually adopt ideas that practically assist in these topic areas in moving towards greater equity, greater community, and so forth. Thanks.
When I think about equity, we've got programs that give rate discounts, special rates to low-income customers. We've got different kinds of subsidies. But what I think is really going to help disadvantaged communities and low-income customers is, the way you build wealth in our economic system is you own assets. And it's the value of the assets, particularly if they can generate income, that you build wealth. And so I come back to, when we think about distributed resources, we're not just distributing technology, we're democratizing the ownership of the assets. It's possible now to own assets that generate income. Going back to my first point of being able to supply energy that serves local load without going through the bulk wholesale market system, if we can create organizational structures, it could be under a city government, it could be a tribal authority, it could be a local co-op, different business models where if we now have a transactive market at the local level for energy transactions, the assets can generate revenues and those revenues can build wealth within the community. So I think a lot about how do we really invigorate local ownership models, because the technology is all there to be able to have local energy systems.
Thank you, Lorenzo. Doug, Jim?
Yeah, I really appreciate. No, Jim, were you ready to go? You can go ahead if you'd like.
Sure. Oh, I just wanted to amplify Lorenzo's point that those local resources need to receive not only the ISO wholesale market price, but also, as Doug talked about, the transmission price. And if, in a world where carbon is valued, the carbon price, and there may be other values that need to be recognized, and finding ways to compensate local clean resources for the multiple values that they provide is essential. And we've not done a good job of that.
Yeah, I want to agree with everything I heard from Lorenzo and Jim. There's some things in there that I hadn't heard before that I'm still thinking through. But my own perspective is, there was a comment in the chat earlier today about people that don't have the cash flow to go through this. This is something that I've been working on at the regional level for many years. There are several people who would say that the way to achieve flexible demand is just to charge people a lot of money. I think, oh, there are a bunch of people, I just think about my neighbors who live right next to me who don't know how to spell kilowatt. It's just not their industry. So is that the right move for them? And when we go and talk to customers, I can say it is a huge difference between, oh, by the way, you're going to save money. No, I really promise you're going to save money every month. So you should pay me. And I promise you're going to save money every month. And now imagine that same conversation when I walk into a customer and I say, I'm going to send you a check every month. We're going to install this thing together, and I'm going to earn some revenues from state programs and market and the wholesale markets. And then I'm going to send you a check every month. It makes a huge difference to what someone in the chat mentioned, cash flow. To those people who have to worry about cash flow, then they can't invest that money up front and hope it provides a return later on. So I'm still processing Lorenzo's thought that hadn't occurred to me of, is there a way we can get assets in their hands that earn money for them as a way of building wealth? I'm not an economist, I'm an engineer, so I'm still processing that part. But it sounds similar to the experience that I have with, if you promise people, no, I really promise you, spend the money here and you'll save it, you often get turned down. And if I could just make one more plug real quick, a big piece of this discussion, if we ask people to electrify their transportation and their heating, but then the cost of electricity shoots up, then that's a huge disincentive to get them to do that. And so we have to manage the cost of the electricity that we're asking them to use. And my planning argument that I keep coming back to, convincing the planners not to overbuild and spend more money than they need to, is a big piece of that.
Thanks so much for that reminder, Doug. It's occurred to us, but you brought it home that much more effectively. Let me turn over to the audience for questions in the room or online, if our folks here reading the chat can help as well. Any questions here in the room? Yeah, go ahead.
Question. I was just wondering, is there a natural conflict between private utilities and the profits that they're making and some of the things that we're talking about here, which is really taking away their profits to some extent? And I wonder if you've seen that conflict and if you had any comment about how that affects what we're talking about today.
Any takers, Doug? You're
My answer is yes. I worked for public advocates and consumer advocates across the country for 18 years, and my answer is yes. Especially in those areas like New England where the utilities have divested of generation. Their primary source of revenue is based on the transmission system. I don't know the distribution system nearly as well, so there may be a whole other piece of this that I'm just not an expert on, so I'm not going to say much. But at the higher voltages, that is the source of their revenue. So more transmission lines means more revenue for them, and fewer transmission lines hurts them. My semi-naive piece of it tries to tell the friends that I know in all of those companies, you're going to make plenty of money on changes that we're going to have to do. You don't also need lots of transmission or lots more than you really need. So don't worry, you'll be fine. But I'm not quite as much as an expert on this. But I do think there's a conflict, and we're going to have to manage that. We're going to have to work with them to get this done, and we're going to have to manage that piece.
I agree with both transmission and distribution. As essentially building assets and getting a rate of return means they want to build more assets. And so going back to my planning example from before, if we plan and we overbuild, but they're getting a guaranteed return on that overbuilding, the fact that it's excess capacity or more than we need doesn't hurt them at all. And in a way, then distributed resources become adversarial for investor-owned utilities that want to build assets, because ultimately the promise of local resources is that when you're building supply close to load, you need less infrastructure than if you're relying entirely on remote supply resources. So I think that's a crucial element of the challenge right now.
Jim, anything you want to add there?
Well, I think that from my perspective, as we bifurcate, trifurcate, and further break the power market down, where you've got a distribution utility, a transmission enterprise, and a wholesale power supply, there's nobody that's adding up all of the values that a distributed resource can provide. It's a threat to the incumbent providers, but there's nobody who's assigned the job of adding up the value of the type of resource that Doug showed. So Doug is with an aggregator who's trying to make a living adding all those values up. But I think that the state, in its role as a utility regulator, needs to assign that job to someone and let or at least enable multiple someones to enter into that business and do as Doug said. We're going to write you a check every month, for letting us work with you to develop this resource. It's going to save you money and it's going to save everybody else money, and we're going to get a slice of that. But ideally, the bulk power system will be a lower cost bulk power system, will avoid the construction of transmission lines, and will serve local load at a net cost that is lower in dollars and environmental impact. But somebody's got to add it all together. And I think to a great extent, the current framework that we have for power in this country impairs our ability to do that.
Thank you, Jim. Well put. Don't the citizens of Maine need a Doug Hurley representative? Jessica has a second question, and I fear I'm soon to get the hook after that. But
Yep.
One or two. Yeah.
So I have Matt Pitzer raising his hand in the Zoom room. Matt, if you can unmute yourself, you're welcome to ask your question.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm Matt Pitzer. I'm an architect and I'm on buildings working group representing Merida. And one of the things, Doug, when you showed that factory example, my mind kind of immediately shifted to the large users that require the on-site kind of redundancy or backups, thinking about hospitals or critical infrastructure that often use, diesel backups or diesel generators right now. Are there programs or systems in place that you're aware of that are pushing more towards these battery systems, or, ideas that we might be able to offer to say, maybe our local fire stations or, MEMA resources, things like that could actually be used as these kind of local little power centers? Is there anything that you're familiar with for those types of ideas?
Yeah, I'm familiar with two different angles to that. One is some of the programs that are giving incentives to reduce your load are just cutting out fossil generation. They're saying, sorry, you can't use your combined heat and power unit or a diesel backup unit to do this. We won't, you're not eligible. So that's one side, and maybe they did originally and now they're sort of, removing them later on. The other one is, wow, it just left my head. That's a little embarrassing and I apologize for that. I had two different angles. And I got it back. Sorry. We have seen 3 different cities now, Cambridge, Boston, and New York, who are implementing policies that give specific penalties for CO2 emissions. So BUEDO, it's called BUEDO in Cambridge, BERDO, Boston Energy Reduction, and then in New York, it's called Local Law 97. I was just reading their latest regulations last night. They are all assigning CO2 costs. And at least in New York and in Boston, and we're working with Cambridge as well, we have gone to them and said, you should include in your regulations not just an annual factor that says no matter when you consume power, here's how much the cost is, but instead allow us at our option to track the emission rate of carbon on the electric grid hour to hour. And if we can figure out a way to use more load during cleaner hours and less load during the dirtier hours, the higher carbon rates, then we should be allowed to do those calculations and provide them to you and reduce total CO2 output that way. A battery is one great way to do that. You could also just flex your load in other ways to achieve the same thing. So in one sense, you're just being unenrolled. On the other side, there are some places that are starting to have regulations that are going to charge you, and you have the option to avoid that cost.
Thank you, Doug.
Matt, if your question was, is there a program for large batteries at hospitals? The answer is yes, at Efficiency Maine, and give me a call.
That was Ian, Matt. Sarah, did you or somebody else, fortunate, somebody have a question?
Sure.
Yeah, our last question, I think.
Yeah, well, so the first question that was asked, I would say it's probably not a coincidence about sort of metro utility conflicts. Probably not a coincidence that Jim's example in Seattle, I presume Seattle Light is a muni or a customer-owned co-op, which is why they look at things underneath those wires in the distribution plan. But my question is, on this, I'm just interested to hear from the panel. I think the biggest challenge is that the value that the provide comes in so many different buckets. Some of them are easy to monetize, some of them are very hard to monetize, and they come from different parts of the market. What can Maine as a state, as a program administrator do to make all that value accessible to the person making the investment in today? Because right now it's either, state gets it for free and therefore we're getting us the others that we need, or they're not getting built because they're not able to monetize. Say we're only getting the bulk power value, but not the T value, or not the D value, or not the ancillary services value. Who's doing this well?
You guys get that in the chat, or would you like us to paraphrase?
I could hear it okay between your notes. Thank you, Jessica, and some of what the room was saying. And
You want to answer it then, Doug?
Sure. Yeah, I'll offer an answer. I'm not sure it's the answer, but I'll offer an answer that it certainly is a challenge. And especially as the grid changes, we're about to see several hundred megawatts of offshore wind. That's going to change the grid in New England when the clean hours and the dirty hours are. Especially as those things change, the less sophisticated of a customer you're trying to influence, the harder that's going to be. But to the extent that you can have a combination of different value streams that you talked about, the wholesale markets are going to do their thing, and we're going to try and encourage them to do those right. But at the same time, where the gaps are, the state of Maine could come in and do their own programs that, as I said earlier, as best you can, try to integrate those two things together so that we get the right signal on when you want us to charge and discharge, if it's a battery, or otherwise flex your demand.
So let me describe my participation in this market as an EV owner. All right, right now I'm on a fixed period time of use rate. I have the charge controller in my car set to charge during low cost hours. I can drive home, I plug in, and in the morning I've got a car full of electricity. The better solution would be to drive in, plug in, and have a choice of pushing the green button, give me an economy charge, or the red button, give me an urgent charge. And when I push the green button, which I nearly always will do, a very sophisticated system will figure out what are the best hours to charge my battery within the parameters I've set of give me a full tank by morning. And if that means charging for a few minutes here and a few minutes there to provide ancillary services, that's fine with me. And if it means concentrating my charge into a couple hours when there's a whole lot of wind blowing, that's okay with me. And if it means charging at a steady rate, that's okay with me. And if it means curtailing when my neighbor's oven comes on so that my local transformer isn't overloaded, that's okay with me. I've pressed the green button, and a sophisticated, probably artificial intelligence driven brain that is paying attention takes on the job of making sure that I get what I want at the lowest cost to me, and while we're at it, the lowest cost to my neighbors and the planet.
Lorenzo, anything to add there? You're still
Lorenzo,
muted. Yeah.
No, I think that was well stated. I don't have anything to add. Thank you.
Well, let me then turn back over to David running the show here. But first, I'd like a hand for our panel. I said you were 18, and you proved me right. Welcome to stay as well. Thanks.
Great. Excellent. So we're going to use the last 15 minutes or so that we have to talk about what this all means for the work ahead for us as working groups. There's 3 working groups here that convene this. We all have a part of this puzzle, whether transportation, buildings, and the energy folks. I'm actually going to use this whiteboard over here and ask you all to start shouting out. And Jess, you can help me what's going on online in the chat and all that. Just let me get my video. The video is going to be miserable, so I'll just apologize in advance. All right. So what I'm going to do is ask folks, in the room, and Jess, you can help me on the chat. What does this mean for the conversations we need to have over the next 2 to 3 months? Right? Then we'll figure out where those conversations are going to happen. But first, what do we actually need to talk about in the context of developing potential recommendations for an updated climate action plan? What does it mean in the way back? Yeah.
We need to define scales.
Okay.
Scales of focus, because we've got residential, we've got medium scale, then we've got a large scale industrial. And each one, I think, has specific challenges and likely specific solutions unique to that scale.
Okay. Great. So we need to tease this apart a little bit and say, what does that mean for us? Okay. Great. What else do we need to talk about? Yep. And now go to the first one.
We need an action plan for education and information exchange with the PUC.
Okay. For education and interaction with PUC. Okay. My handwriting is so bad, so you guys are just gonna. I'll work with you in deciphering it. Gary.
My comment is somewhat related to this, and that is that anything that touches the utility environment that we talk about, we need to keep in mind what the regulatory structure is and determine what changes might be necessary to it to accommodate what we want to do. Because really, that a lot of times we have these initiatives and forget about the regulatory structure into which they are being passed on.
Okay.
I think, following up on that, I think that means that also you need the right people in the room. Like, you need to make sure that the people who are most familiar with those regulatory structures are part of the making of the sausage that we are about to embark on.
Okay. Yeah.
Something I found this morning I thought was really insightful is it doesn't have to be super hard. What it's actually going into is because DERs can do everything, is that we want them to do everything. So we can start with them doing just a few things.
Right.
And we can do that in the next 3 years. That's what the next 20 years.
So I'm going to put that as don't overcomplicate, right? Think about the things that are actually closer and within reach, as opposed, in addition to the grand issue.
Yeah, contextualize the grand vision, but don't overcomplicate.
Yeah. Good.
This may sound like a tangent, but as somebody who has installed solar along the interstate, if we keep the crap beat out of them for doing it, I think public education, what struck me here today is I'm a lot less worried about technology and our ability to electrify everything. But if we get so far ahead of what the public understands and the NPSOs that we're seeing, we have to bring them along. We just can't be the smartest people in the room and say, hey, look at us, we're so incredibly brilliant. You have to just listen and hear us and follow us. There is a public education piece that is important for that.
Thanks, Joyce.
Yeah, Scott Cunningham. The demand pricing piece seems so important in this, and I would really like to have a good understanding of why we're not doing that yet. I don't know the history of it well enough, and I think it's going to be important to understand what have been the barriers to doing this in the past as we try to move towards them in the future.
Got it. I'm putting that next to the look at those regulatory structures. Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
That will be TOU for short.
Great. What else we got?
Yeah, I think it's maybe sort of builds on Fortunat's point, but if we're thinking about specific recommendations for the climate plan, what's the biggest bang for the buck or lowest hanging fruit? Like, is it managed EV charging? Is it like institutional battery installations, that have like a lot of capacity to be able to get all that value out of? I'm wondering what those are. And I think just underscoring the public education piece, I think that's, I think Johanna, I glimpsed it in the chat, also mentioned that. I think that's hugely important and has a big equity component too.
I want to do a deliberate pause for any working group members who are on the online
Jess, is anything coming in on the chat?
No, I'd love to hear from the chat, or if you want to raise your hand, you're welcome to chime in. Additionally, I am typing the responses because I know you can't hear most of the room.
Thanks, Jess.
Yeah.
If someone wants to chime in, raise your hand, throw it in the chat, either way.
Hey, Sharon Klein, you want to go ahead and speak?
Sure. I was just typing in the chat, so it's just probably faster to speak. I was just thrilled to hear how community ownership was brought up by so many people as a critical piece in this. So I think that I would love to see that be brought to the forefront of some of our recommendations, especially thinking about how to tailor our recommendations to fully leverage the advantages of community ownership in terms of addressing energy equity and justice, and also reducing T&D expansion and adding a bit of economy of scale to residential solutions, but thinking at the community scale, and that there's a lot of benefits to that.
Thanks. Can I also turn to Michael Stoddard?
Thanks, Jess. I just want to make sure that in the notes, somebody has requested that we do what we can through this process to identify costs, because we've heard about so many different pathways for this and so many different alternatives, and in my experience, oftentimes folks just don't know whether we're talking about $1,000 or $10,000 or $100,000 or $1 million about these different kinds of things. And so while some of the discussion is about what could work technically, is it technically feasible? Is it commercially available now? We also need to do the best we can to bring into the discussion whatever the relative costs are, because I think that will help inform our understanding of whether some of these things are going to be quite easy to do quickly, and we should pick that low-hanging fruit, and then others are going to be a little bit more challenging, and we have to understand that those may take more work. My favorite example of this is the discussion that we've had throughout this morning about the stationary small batteries that people are now buying to put into their homes or their garage so that they have emergency backup power. And from Efficiency Maine standpoint, this is just practically free demand management opportunity because they already paid to buy the battery. It's in their home. They said, I really want emergency backup. I understand it's going to be expensive, but it's worth it to me. So I'm going to buy it. And they put it in. And then we can come along later and say, if you're not using it on certain days, I'd love to take advantage of that. And we could even give you some money back. And so, but I would have never known how hard or easy that might have been if I didn't start to understand better what the costs are, both for the equipment and the sort of administrative things you have to do to run a program to dispatch or take advantage of those resources. So I would encourage us to try to bring forward information on costs.
David, implicit in Michael's remarks, but not specifically mentioned, are the savings also involved?
Yep. So both sides of that equation, right?
Well, from today's discussion, I would say we need a load flexibility plan. We need a rate design plan.
Yep.
And how those fit together and how they fit into other things is a different question, but we need both of those. And then to Sharon's point that Joanna also jumped in on, I wanted to say that it seems like based on today's discussion, one of the best ways to explore community ownership and to protect local community renewable investments is what was talked about on distributed energy resources policy framework to protect local distribution resources. That seems like an incredibly important point, and it does go to that point as well.
Yeah, in this, right? Protecting local resources. When you say protect, you're meaning that comment about how it stays within.
A policy framework to be able to keep those resources from going outside the local distribution network and having transmission costs added and having other costs added.
Okay.
And then my last point would be what was brought up today was regulatory and connection barriers. Seems like that needs to be a part of the whole discussion, actually.
Right. Okay.
And then I'll jump back to here.
Thank you. I agree with the importance of public education on all this, both to get people to agree to adopt these types of technologies, but also sign on for whatever the demand management load shifting program would be to allow either they or others to implement some of the benefits of it. But I think beyond just public education, and this was highlighted at a larger workshop more recently, we need to be thinking about behavioral change and what it will actually take for folks to be willing to consider these. I think education is one thing, but actually looking at the motivators for what changes people's behavior when it comes to adopting new technologies, being willing to allow others to send them signals to change how they behave in a way that might impact your vehicle, your home, your business is really key. I don't know, we haven't talked a lot about that.
Thanks, Ben. Gary?
We've heard a lot of things from the various presenters that talk about interesting things like the transactional market for EPRs and lots of these individual programs. They're all kind of in the context of one big system. Okay? And in Maine, we don't have one big system. And so, in addition, we're talking about low-hanging fruit, and let's look at this program, and let's look at that program. Maybe this is where the kind of planning comes in. I think we need to establish a context for where all of this is going to go, rather than, I think there's a danger of looking at things incrementally. Oh, let's do this. Targets of opportunity. Let's do this. Let's do this. Let's do this. What is the architecture that's going to meet the goals that we want this essentially new distribution system to work? And does it incorporate community microgrids? How does it deal with, not that this whole vision will be purely defined in the next 3 or 4 months, but I think something that establishes the context into which all of these recommendations will likely.
Right, that bigger story, right? That bigger picture of where we're going. Okay. And you have online, and then I'm going to grab, unless you want to add.
This is just a follow-up to Julie's point. I'm Rebecca Schultz, Natural Resources Council of Maine. Part of what needs to happen in that vision is to unlock the customer investments that Michael Stoddard was just mentioning, except beyond just the residential level. Wherever those interests in making that investment is coming from, that diffuses the cost for everybody, for the entire system. So we need to build a framework, a regulatory framework that permits those investments wherever there's interest in them occurring on the system, and in whatever markets, for whatever values they can attract for that initial investment to capitalize and serve multiple purposes and to be interconnected, be it for a microgrid purpose or for, value at a sub-circuit constraint that could also be served in addition to wholesale, whatever, arbitrage. So that sort of needs to be the goal of this regulatory reimagining.
Love it. I want to go online. Who do we have?
We've got Tom Welch, and then we've got Steve Clemmer. So Steve, you're on deck. Tom, you can go first.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate it. This dovetails nicely with the last comment. It seems to me if you're looking for an overall conceptual framework for a lot of what we've been talking about this morning, it might be to think of how do you monetize the net value to the system of any of the activities we're talking about, and sort of underneath that, in what market do you have to make the appropriate changes? Because some of them are going to be regional, some of them are going to be local. what jurisdiction is the most relevant to achieve the appropriate monetization, and what rate design changes and other sort of ancillary regulatory changes are needed to ensure that when you monetize something, when you are compensating someone for a net benefit to the system, that you're not either underpaying or overpaying them. So I think it's sort of a matter of I mean, virtually all the stuff we were discussing this morning would benefit from effective and efficient markets that actually allowed the flow of money to go to the people who are actually providing a particular kind of benefit to the system.
That's
All right.
great. What else we had?
Just one, Steve Clemmer.
Steve, go ahead.
Hi, thanks. Steve Clemmer with the Union of Concerned Scientists. Thanks for the great discussion. I wanted to just build a little bit on something I think Kendra brought up in the chat, and I think Rebecca touched on a little bit too, and that is the need for individual customers, especially low and moderate income customers, to be able to invest in DERs and considering the high upfront costs. And I do think financing is a really important mechanism of that, and as combined with the rebates, combined with all the incentives everybody else is talking about. But I know Efficiency Maine has some programs in place. They have the Clean Energy Accelerator, and there's also a lot of federal money available through the Inflation Reduction Act, including EPA's Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. So I would encourage us to think about ways we could further leverage that money to help with sort of the upfront investment and helping to finance some of those investments, especially in low and moderate income communities. Thanks.
Super. Thanks, Steve. Okay. Let me read off a little bit what we've got.
And I had this vision that we'd have a list of things in a very, you have a couple more things? Okay.
I just want
Yeah, go.
I'm Naomi Beal from Passive House, Maine, and one thing that I haven't quite heard about, I know the point is great, but the concept of efficiency first and efficiency goals and projections hasn't come up in this conversation, and I'm just wondering where that does.
Where the efficiency conversation comes up. When you say
Efficiency in terms of, in the way that it couples with our grid and distribution goals.
Yep. Ahmed mentioned that. The cleanest electron is the one you don't use. Yeah.
And specifically on this topic, we have about grid size. What we care about in efficiency now is the kilowatt hours that we eliminate after peak, not the rest of the year. We should have a different view of efficiency than we used to have. Sharing any kilowatt hour doesn't really matter. We are going to live in a world of energy abundance, but peaks are expensive.
Interesting.
Yeah. So just in the context of all of that, something that was mentioned in the panel about the transition between the distribution and the transmission and making a cutoff point, you've got to bear in mind unintended consequences. When you take away a revenue source to a utility, prices go up. And so we have to just bear in mind what these decisions will cause. Yeah.
Right. There's nothing that doesn't cause all kinds of ripples. Yeah. Last word, and then let's round up.
Another lens here is just who's doing what. Efficiency Maine Trust versus the utilities versus the Public Utilities Commission versus a new entity perhaps.
Right. Who does what? Okay. I gotta stop writing because it's just not helpful.
So I had a vision that we have a bunch of things that we know we needed to talk about, and they would neatly line up with our 3 working groups. They do not at all, right? They are intertwined deeply, at least what I see, right? At the highest level, needing to think about a load flexibility plan, right? And a rate design plan. Like, if that's something, maybe it's easy as just saying that, right? Our updated climate action plan says, Maine, go do that, right? Maybe it's that easy, but we need to think about our scales of focus. We've got to work with the PUC in different ways, and we need to look at regulatory structure, barriers, demand pricing in the past. Why hasn't it worked or not worked, right? We need to get the right people in the room as we're doing that. We need to look at low-hanging fruit, even as we're lifting our gaze up to this big architecture conversation that Gary's putting up on the table, right? And so we need to do these things, and community ownership seem really powerful and interesting, and sort of community level, and that vision that Jim was particularly, or Lorenzo, excuse me, was particularly in. Like, that's super interesting. In all of that, we should be eyes wide open in how we're looking at cost, feasibility, the real savings involved, and thinking about how all of this can unlock customer choices that can help maximize net value for the system, right? So there's a lot that needs to happen. I don't really see like, oh, well, that's clearly transportation working group. Like, that doesn't really work, right? So I'm on the fly here just going to recommend something. And let's tease it out here with the co-chairs. Which is, it kind of feels like these things are unto themselves in everywhere. And why don't we have a set of conversations in February and March about them and see how far we get, right? We don't need to solve all this in an updated climate action plan. What we need to do is set the state in a direction so that actors can go out and act upon that updated climate action plan, right? So for instance, we don't need to make a load flexibility plan. We need to say one needs to be made, right? So we need to push it that far forward in the next 2-3 months on all these interesting things. And why don't we set up, and it's more meetings. I'm not sure everybody's super excited about that. But it just feels like it doesn't work neatly to parse out the work into this working group over here and that working group over there. Co-chairs in particular, how does that sound if we were to just convene and everybody here who's been excited about this conversation is part of it, right? Who wants to be, right? Probably virtual, right? A little soured on the whole hybrid thing today. Ben, you were trying to jump in.
Well, I agree with that. And I have a suggested addition.
Yeah.
One thing that we could potentially, what came to me in all of this is that all of these working groups, all of these sectors will see benefit from progress on this. It's going to be very important to each of them. And so maybe one of the things that we could do at the working group level could be to look at this list, talk through it and say, why is this going to be important to our sector? And why should we be trying to push this forward? Because if we're looking at it just in terms of energy or just in terms of buildings or transportation, it's not going to likely have the same impact. But if we, coalition building, basically, if we're kind of articulating why everybody needs to be in favor of this, then that could be maybe a powerful outcome of this planning action.
Love it. Okay.
Well, to build on that, I think.
Can you project loudly in this direction? Sorry, Ben was kind of hard to hear.
Sarah Tracy, to build on that, being clear on not just, I think being clear on the goal, like what is the concrete outcome from achieving that goal. So I think I said this at the last energy working group meeting, but if we are doing demand response for the purpose from the energy side of reducing peaks or facilitating the addition of renewable supply, we need to explain why that's important. We are then avoiding transmission costs. We need to be very clear about like this connecting the dots and what the goal is so that we're not just like building a plane and we have no idea why that particular plane is being built.
Love it. Okay. And hopefully not too much jargon, more simplicity, right? And I thought a lot of the panelists did a great job today of doing that. Ken started us off in a nice way too. So yes, and Ben, the idea that each working group spends just a moment to say, why are we fired up about this? And we want to see this in the climate action plan. And then we can schedule up some meetings where we'll do work on this and figure out how far are we going to get in just a handful of meetings between now and May, right? But we set the state up for at least heading in the right direction on this, and it gets in the updated climate action plan. All right? I'm just trying to like measure like how far we're we're going to get in a couple months, but knowing we can settle ourselves in to a framework that feels really good for all of you.
Be more efficient in meeting.
Yes, let's do it together like this. Yeah. Kathleen?
This will come later.
Yeah.
But just so we don't forget, as we frame this up for the Climate Council, it's also an opportunity to start that public education that we all mentioned. We have the opportunity to get all of our silly questions on the table because other people have those silly questions too. And to think about the best way to present not just the work that we're doing, but the way that we're doing it together and the intentionality that we're bringing to it as a first step in building that support.
Love it. Yeah, Michael, last word.
I really appreciate the economic efficiency question because economic efficiency measures are, I think, incredibly important. But I also wanted to connect that to the financing question because a lot of the times when you're dealing with lower income households, economic efficiency measures are exactly the kind of thing that they need financing for.
It's here. Right here. Where am I?
Right in front of you. Where is efficiency? Yeah. So just financing, I think, for that is going to be important and something that needs to be discussed.
Love it. Okay. Super. I'm going crazy arrow. All right. I want to thank everyone. I want to thank everybody online who stuck with for 4 hours online. Wow. Thanks, everyone. Our hybrid was suboptimal, you might say, and improvised.